As I'm talking and you want to see the PowerPoint, I think if you can hide the thumbnail of video so that you can see the full screen. But yes, I'll begin. If you take in these words here, you might be wondering if I had anything to say today. James Edward Austen Leigh wrote in his rather insipid and whitewashed memoir of his aunt that her rather barren life couldn't possibly have known any scandals. But surely no one's life is truly devoid of any drama or scandal. I believe this was merely a way to feed into the narrative of our dear Aunt Jane, which was more pleasing to the Victorian punters that James Edward Austen Leigh was writing to. So hopefully I'll show you throughout this talk that there was plenty of scandal for the observant Jane Austen to gossip over. Jane Austen gleefully wrote to her sister, "I am proud to say that I have a very good eye at an adulteress." She had seen said adulteress at a Bath ball in 1801, and having written Lady Susan in 1794, she clearly knew how to write one too, even from an early age. Because Jane Austen grew up on the tail end of the 18th century, known for its bawdiness. Just think, it was a time when tales of prostitution such as Moll Flanders and Fanny Hill had been published, not that the daughter of a vicar had necessarily read them. But given that the Regency period was known as the age of scandal, gossip in polite parlours was rife with illicit tales of adultery. Why, the Prince Regent himself, along with most of the aristocracy, was well known for his extramarital affairs. Here he is depicted by the great satirist of the day, James Gilray. Though Jane Austen dedicated Emma to him, she had no love for the man. In fact, she wrote to her friend Martha Lloyd in 1813, "I hate him." One particular act of adultery I'm going to discuss is the Powlett affair, which happened in Southampton whilst Jane was in residence. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Powlett was a Southampton acquaintance of the Austen family, and in 1808 took Viscount Sackville, later 5th Duke of Dorset, to court over an adulterous relationship with his wife, Mary Letitia Powlett, in a crim-con suit. This is short for criminal conversation and is essentially an adultery trial where the cuckolded husband may sue for damages because his property, i.e. the wife, has lessened in value. The details were these. Lord Sackville met Colonel and Mrs. Powlett at the Stockbridge racecourse on 9th of June, where Sackville overheard the Colonel arrange to go yachting with a friend the next day. The next morning, after the Colonel had gone to the Southampton Quay, Mrs. Powlett ordered post horses for her carriage and drove to the White Hart Inn in Winchester. Lord Sackville arrived soon after her, took a light breakfast downstairs, then went up to her room. The landlord, growing suspicious, sent his wife up to investigate. The bedroom door was locked, so she burst in upon them through an adjoining door. News of the trial appeared thus in the papers. Another elopement has taken place in high life. A noble Viscount, Lord S, has gone off with a Mrs. P, the wife of a relative of the noble Marquis. Mrs. P's faux pas with Lord S took place at an inn near Winchester. As you can see, the names are concealed with initials and dashes in order to protect the editors legally. Though the details included made it easy to guess the truth, Jane certainly did. And in fact, she was sorry to hear the news. This is a sad story about Mrs. Powlett. I should not have suspected her of such a thing. She stayed the sacrament, I remember, the last time that you and I did. A hint of it, with initials, was in yesterday's Courier, and Mr. Moore guessed it to be Lord Sackville, believing there was no other Viscount S in the peerage. And so it proved. Though Jane credits this Mr. Moore for solving the mystery, I have no doubt in my mind that it was Jane herself who checked a copy of the peerage and got to the bottom of it. That the news of the affair and trial appeared in the papers is unsurprising. no different to today's celebrities having their indiscretions splashed across the gossip rags and the internet. When it appeared in the Hampshire Chronicle on the 1st of August, 1808, it was written that no private subject has so much occupied the attention of the neighbourhood as this affair. It was common enough and even happens in Jane's novels. For instance, in Mansfield Park, after Fanny's cousin Maria runs off with Henry Crawford, this notice appears in the papers dripping with Jane Austen's signature satire. It was with infinite concern that the newspaper had to announce to the world a matrimonial fracas in the family of Mr. R of Wimpole Street, the beautiful Mrs. R, whose name had not long been enrolled in the lists of Hymen, and who had promised to become so brilliant a leader in the fashionable world, having quitted her husband's roof in company with the well-known and captivating Mr. C, the intimate friend and associate of Mr. R, and it was not known even to the editor of the newspaper whither they were gone. As with the Powlett affair, the names are concealed, though everyone knows who they refer to. And as I said before, Mrs. Powlett had indeed run off with the Viscount. When they were discovered by the inn's landlady, it was in a compromising situation. The Viscount left the room and drove away in his carriage. Mrs. Powlett returned back to Southampton in hers. The trial, which took place in Southampton whilst Jane Austen was in residence there, occupied still more public attention. Colonel Powlett attempted to get £10,000 in damages from Lord Sackville, but the jury placed the value of the lady's virtue somewhat lower at just £3,000. The Powlett affair relates to acquaintances, albeit those made in Southampton. But what about affairs closer to the Austen family? There have been murmurings by some biographers that Philadelphia Hancock, aunt to Jane and brother to the Reverend George Austen, had an adulterous affair whilst living in India. It was allegedly with Warren Hastings, later the first Governor-General of Bengal. It is said her child, Elizabeth, later Elizabeth the Comtesse de Feuillide, was the result of the illicit relationship between them. Philadelphia was shipped off to India to find a husband, as her surgeon father had died young and left no provision for his family. There she married another surgeon, Tyso Saul Hancock, who was 20 years her senior. It was asked in Calcutta she met Warren Hastings, and the lifelong friendship began. However, whilst there is no firm evidence to prove Eliza was indeed the daughter of Warren Hastings, local gossips maliciously said it is beyond a doubt that she abandoned herself to Mr. Hastings. Certain aspects of the situation explain where the suspicions came from. The Hancocks had been married 8 full years before Eliza came along, and only after they had made friends with the Hastings. Furthermore, Hastings, who was godfather to Eliza, set up a trust fund of £10,000 so that she might be brought up as a lady. As well as generous, Hastings was also very affectionate towards Eliza. In a private letter to Philadelphia, he wrote, "Kiss my dear Bessie for me, and assure her of my tenderest affections. May the God of goodness bless you both." The dubious paternity of this Eliza makes me wonder over another natural daughter named Eliza in Austen's novel Sense and Sensibility. Colonel Brandon relates the whole sad history of his first love to Eleanor Dashwood. This girl, also named Eliza, marries his cruel brother, but later descends into a life of vice. Brandon then finds her dying, but before she does, Eliza left to my care her only child, a little girl, the offspring of her first guilty connection. This little girl is also named Eliza and seems doomed to repeat the mistakes of her mother. Seduced by Willoughby, who later abandons her, and as Brandon puts it, such has been the unhappy resemblance between the fate of mother and daughter. Despite the whisperings of cousin Eliza's legitimacy, Mr. Hancock appears never to have suspected his daughter's paternity, or at least affected not to show it. Perhaps due to pride, perhaps because he could see the material benefit of it, or perhaps because such things were not wholly uncommon. Legally, however, the child was his. The Austen family were passionate defenders of Warren Hastings years later, when he was impeached by the House of Commons for a catalogue of crimes during his time in India, including maladministration, corruption, extortion, and the judicial execution of a Maharaja. The trial lasted 7 years, with 20 counts of indictments against him. Philadelphia Hancock was in London for much of this time and sent dispatches back to Steventon. In one, she wrote, "I had the satisfaction of hearing all of the celebrated orators, Sheridan, Burke, and Fox. The first was so low we could not hear him. The second so hot and hasty we could not understand. The third was highly superior to either, as we could distinguish every word, but not to our satisfaction, as he is so much against Mr. Hastings, whom we all wish so well." To face these eloquent prosecutors was no doubt terrible and humiliating for Hastings, particularly as the trial was treated by the public as the fashionable entertainment of the season. The poet William Cowper, whom Jane Austen had admired, and incidentally, Chawton House has lately acquired the night copy of William Cowper's poem, so I'm very excited about that, but I digress. Cowper was a school friend of Hastings and wrote the following lines at the time. "Hastings, I knew thee young, and of a mind, well young, humane, conversable, and kind. Nor can I well believe thee gentle then, now grown a villain, and the worst of men. But rather some suspect, who have oppressed and worried thee as not themselves the best." Finally, after 7 years, Hastings was acquitted of all charges. A third of the lords who had attended the trial's openings had since died, and public interest had hugely waned, particularly with the advent of the French Revolution. Legal fees apparently cost Hastings £70,000, though some of it was reimbursed by the East India Company. He wasn't the only man connected to the Austens who practically lost his fortune, though. 1816, known as the Year Without Summer. Going back to James Edward Austen's, what I consider rather ludicrous quote about his aunt, I would contest that 1816 very much broke the smooth current of her life's course. To give you some context, 1816, known as the Year Without Summer, was so called because of an event that occurred half a world away. On April 1815, Mount Tambora erupted on the Indonesian island of Samoa, spewing over 19 million cubic miles of volcanic ash in the atmosphere. This ash traveled in the upper atmosphere, blocking the sun, remained there and steadily spread around the globe by the winds. The geologist Charles Lyell would reflect that the darkness occasioned in the daytime by the ashes in Java was so profound that nothing equal to it was ever witnessed in the darkest night. It was in this gloomy atmosphere that Mary Shelley composed the beginnings of Frankenstein at Lake Geneva, when Lord Byron challenged the group to write a ghost story. So how did Jane Austen react to the poor weather caused by this mountainous explosion? She wrote to her niece, "Mrs. Digweed returned yesterday through all the afternoon's rain and was, of course, wet through. But in speaking of it, she never once said it was beyond everything, which I'm sure it must have been." But this last summer of Jane Austen's before she died was not only a miserable one in terms of weather, but also in terms of Austen family fortunes. Things began poorly for her youngest brother Charles, the baby of the family, and a naval man like his older brother Frank. In February of that year, his ironically named ship, the Phoenix, was wrecked off the coast of Smyrna. Of the event, the Royal Naval Biography wrote, "Being unable to clear the archipelago before the commencement of a violent gale, he was obliged to bear up and seek shelter in the port of Chisme. But scarcely had he anchored when the wind flew around from southwest to north and blew a perfect hurricane. Everything possible was done to save the ship, notwithstanding which she drove on shore, with 3 anchors ahead after her masts were cut away. All the crew were saved, and the disaster was attributed to the ignorance of the local pilot, with Charles being exonerated in the court-martial, which must necessarily follow such an event. However, Charles wasn't acquitted of blame until the court-martial took place months later in April on board the ship Bombay in the Bay of Tunis. And he spent the interim months in the Med on other men's ships awaiting his fate. Even though he was fully exonerated, the Admiralty didn't like losing a ship, and neither did Charles. This was a definite blot on his career, and it was some time before he obtained another command, not helped by the establishment of peace in 1815 after so many years of war. The Austen family would have anxiously waited for news of Charles's outcome, unable to help in any way. Coming hard on the heels of this disaster, on May 15th, Henry's bank, Austen, Maund and Tilson, stopped payment. I could never begin to do as much justice to this topic as Professor Emma Clary does in her dual biography of Jane and Henry Austen, the banker's sister. On this, I will therefore be brief and urge you to get a copy of her work in order to get the full story, and you can actually get it from Chawton House's online shop. Of his uncle, James Edward Austen Leigh, gives this rather dismissive and lukewarm account. Henry had great conversational powers and inherited from his father an eager and sanguine disposition. He was a very entertaining companion, but had perhaps less steadiness of purpose, certainly less success in life than his brothers. And he did indeed seem to bounce from career to career, from soldier in the militia like George Wickham to banker, where some of his interests lay in creating his own brewery, literary agent to Jane, and finally clergyman. Emma Clary puts Austen Leigh's dismissal down to the familial shame over his embarrassment of a career where he lost the equivalent of millions of pounds in today's money. A number of farmers and small businessmen were ruined when Austen, Maund and Tilson closed the door of their establishment and the Alton Bank collapsed. Henry and his partners faced imprisonment, and any failure to disclose assets could result in the death penalty. His house in London and all the trappings were reclaimed. This included his furniture, valuables, and even his wine cellar. The family was shocked. Caroline Austen, daughter of James, would recall this most serious misfortune as an entire surprise at our house and as little foreseen by the rest of the family. And no wonder, the Austen family in particular severely felt the loss. As those who stood surety for the bank, Henry's uncle, James Leigh Perrott, lost £10,000, and Edward Austen Knight, owner of Chawton House and the Godmersham estate, suffered a financial loss of £20,000, all of which they were ordered to pay by instalments within 1 year. Even Jane lost money, though fortunately just £13, this being the profit of Mansfield Park. Brothers Frank and James also lost hundreds of pounds they could ill afford, and from this moment, Henry and Frank had to stop their payments of £50 a year that they had given their mother since their father's death in 1805. The Austen trio of women therefore found their income much diminished. This was all terrible timing for Edward, lucky Edward, the wealthy brother on whom especially the trio of women had depended, had also suffered severe financial loss and was undergoing a trial of his own that had the potential to be even more ruinous. This was a lawsuit challenging his right to the Chawton inheritance by the Baverstock and Hintons, and had Edward lost, the Austen women would have had no right to their beloved home, Chawton Cottage, and their remaining there would have been entirely at the whim of a new owner and certainly not rent-free. This puts me in mind of Mrs. Bennet's fears of what will happen to the Bennet girls following the death of their father, when she frantically asks, "What is to become of us all? The Collinses will turn us out before he's cold in his grave." Similarly, with Pride and Prejudice and Downton Abbey, the trouble arose because of a sticky business with an entail. It's rather long and complicated, but essentially, the Baverstock-Hintons claim to the Chawton fortune went back as far as Elizabeth Martin Knight, who died in 1737. She had outlived 2 wealthy husbands, but had no children of her own. So she left the Chawton estate to Thomas Broadnax May, who changed his name to Knight. You'll see that there's a recurring theme of Knight family members choosing their heirs and having them change their surnames. Thomas Broadnax May was Elizabeth's distant cousin, but through her maternal line. The Hintons, however, were related to her through her paternal Martin side. So their grievance began here when she chose Thomas for her heir and not them. Thomas had the Godmersham estate in Kent, however, and perhaps Elizabeth wanted to increase the wealth and consequence of Chawton by uniting the 2 estates. Thomas Broadnax May changed his surname to Knight, as I said, and he had a son, also called Thomas. All of these portraits hang at Chawton House. The Hintons couldn't necessarily contest about him inheriting, being a firstborn son. However, this Thomas Knight was the one who adopted Edward Austen, a distant cousin. And here is Edward Austen, then Knight, on his grand tour of Europe. The Bavistocks were once again, in their eyes, overlooked. Edward was not an heir of the body, but they at least were heirs at law. They began proceedings in late 1813, and the matter was not resolved until after Jane's death in 1818, where Edward was forced to acknowledge the claim and pay Bavistock and Hinton the whopping sum of £15,000. To pay this large sum in the wake of the financial cost from the collapse of Henry's Bank, a substantial area of timber was felled that, according to a niece writing half a century later, said, occasioned the great gap in Chawton Wood Park, visible for 30 years afterwards, and probably not filled up again, even now. So by the end of 1816, Charles Austen was living on half pay. Henry Austen, having decided to reinvent himself yet again and had taken orders, was a curate living on just £50 a year. Neither men had a home of their own. James, Edward, and Frank were all coming to terms with huge financial losses, and the 3 women in the cottage were clinging on in the hope that they would not be forced to leave. Jane Austen had just this time finished writing Persuasion, and this quote said by Mrs. Croft rather sums up their situation. We none of us expect to be in smooth waters all our days. Jane Austen once wrote to her niece, Fanny, "Scandal and gossip, yes, I dare say you are well stocked." Little did Jane know how prophetic these words would prove to be, especially to Fanny in particular. This next bit of family gossip occurred after Jane Austen's death, but still interesting nonetheless. It centered around Edward Knight II, who in this rather austere Victorian portrait, which hangs in the dining room at Chawton House, indicates no whiff of scandal in his life. However, that was not the case. As a young man, Edward wished to marry the daughter of a baronet, which, given he was set to inherit both the Godmersham and Chawton estates, one would argue would have been a very respectable match. The snag, however, was that this was no ordinary unconnected baronet. This was Sir Edward Knatchbull, a man of property in Kent, who also happened to be married to Edward's oldest sister, Fanny Knight. She was his second wife and stepmother to his various children, one of whom was Edward's intended, as he saw it. Now, given the proximity in familial relations, although it is not actually incestuous, given that Edward Knight had no blood ties to Sir Edward's daughter, given the Victorian sensibilities, it seemed a little bit close to the bone. And of the match, Sir Edward gave his decided negative. However, determined to find their way to each other, Edward Knight and the daughter of Sir Edward Knatchbull eloped to Gretna Green, no less. Such was the scandal and ripples. The pair were not welcome back in Kent, where Sir Edward Knatchbull's estate lay and where Edward Austen had set up his base more primarily. Therefore, the newlyweds settled in Chawton, and anecdotal evidence suggests that the only member of the Austen family who welcomed them was Aunt Cass, and perhaps goes some way to explaining Fanny's rather frosty dismissal of her uncommon aunts. Moving on. A brutal act like stabbing is not the kind of behaviour that Jane Austen condones in her novels. Yet in March 1814, Jane Austen supported the acquittal of a 10-year-old Chawton boy accused of stabbing a man. In her letters, she refers to the incident as the Bagent business, and it was the stabbing of Stephen Mersh, about 18 years old, by James Bagent, who was the son of William and his second wife, Elizabeth Bagent, of Bagent's Farm, where the family had lived for over 100 years. And here is the cottage as it stands today. Mr. William Bagent, James's father, was a yeoman and, according to the Hampshire Chronicle, many years a respectable inhabitant of that place. As the son of one of his respectable tenant farmers, Edward used his influence to try and acquit the boy James. He enlisted the help of the Right Honourable William Wickham, who was a Justice of the Peace. The name Wickham is enough to grab interest alone, considering his villainous role in Pride and Prejudice. But the Right Honourable William Wickham had a fascinating life irrespective of this connection. He was a secret agent for the English government under the Foreign Secretary, Lord Grenville, and responsible for setting up a complex communication network during the French Wars. I don't know if any of you watched the latter series of Poldark, but it's William Wickham who Poldark has an interaction with and is hired to be an agent for the British government. But I digress. Wickham had a lawyer friend, Thomas Miller, who was to be on the grand jury, and the letters between them at the Hampshire Record Office were copied by Jane Hurst. The letter reads as follows: "My dear sir, your letter has somewhat relieved me from an unpleasant sensation. I felt in decidedly differing in opinion on the Chawton case of my old friend Prouting, to whom I wrote yesterday with all the regard possible, saying that from motives of humanity, I should have been induced to agree with him, but that I concede I had no choice to do so. I received a letter from Clement last night containing, I must say between us, the weakest reasons I ever heard given in defence of the boy. I shall be heartily glad to see you to convey to Alton, and if possible, home. Ever most faithfully yours, Thomas Miller." What I find interesting about the letter is Miller's reluctance to take James Bagent's part, saying here the weakest reasons given in defence of the boy. Clearly, however, Wickham could convince Miller, and he was no doubt an impressive man to be able to do so. Jane Austen refers to her brother Edward's correspondence with Mr. Wickham on the Bagent business, and having read the letters herself, wrote with approval, "They are such thinking, clear, considerate letters as Frank might have written, so he must be an excellent man." Her subsequent plea to Cassandra to speak of the matter to no one, as the letters were sent to Edward quite confidentially, since she believes Mr. Wickham's friends to be one of the judges, revealed the power of patronage even in the courts of law, provided that it was discreet. James was tried in Winchester in March 1814, having been detained in custody for over a month. The case was reported in the Hampshire Chronicle, which you can just about see here. Apologies for the lack of quality. That James was acquitted at the end of March and pronounced a free man, given the weakness of his defence, demonstrates the influence of Jane Austen's family and friends and how effective it proved to be. There's a possibility that James suffered from mental health issues, as his stepsister Jane Andrews later in life described him as very odd and queer and often in low spirits. It's likely that Stephen Marsh, a lad of 18, was teasing James, the local oddity. And given knives were used in many occupations, one would have been close to hand. The incident didn't seem to have any long-term effects on Stephen, for he married in Alton in December 1828, and was in Chawton in the 1851 census, age 55. The early intervention of Jane Austen's family and friends, made with the kindest intention towards the farming Bajent family, didn't seem to help James in the long run, however. 4 years after his acquittal and after the death of Jane Austen, James was put in the papers again. It was as an accomplice to James May, and together they stole 1 duck. For this, James was sentenced 3 months imprisonment and hard labour. I'm not sure what Jane would have thought of that, but perhaps she wouldn't have judged James, given there was an incident of theft in her own family. You may know of the line, "Beware of the unmeaning luxuries of Bath and the stinking fish of Southampton," taken from one of Austen's burlesque juveniles, Love and Friendship. It's good advice, and Jane's aunt, Mrs. Lee Perrott, should most definitely have heeded it. This was the wife of the Austens' wealthy uncle, Lee Perrott, who, as I mentioned earlier, had lost a substantial amount of money from Henry's bank collapse. This particular event, however, happened several years before. In July 1799, there was a major scandal which rocked the Austen family. Jane's wealthy Aunt Lee Perrott was arrested and imprisoned for shoplifting. It was alleged that she stole a card of expensive white lace from a millinery shop. She had bought a cheaper card of black lace from the milliners, and it was later that day, as she walked past the shop again, that she was accosted by the owner, who asked to inspect her package. At that point, it was discovered that a card of white lace worth 20 shillings or £1 was also included in the packet. Mrs. Lee Perrott insisted it was a mistake by a clerk who had accidentally wrapped the white lace along with the black. The owner called it shoplifting. Mrs. Lee Perrott forcefully denied the claim and continued home. A few days later, she was arrested, and the very grand and wealthy Mrs. Lee Perrott was committed to Ilchester Jail. And here is the outline of the shop in question. When news reached the Austen family in Steventon, Mrs. Austen immediately offered to send her daughters to keep her company. It is unbelievable to think of Jane and Cassandra voluntarily going to jail to keep their aunt company. But fortunately, Mrs. Lee Perrott would not hear of allowing those elegant young women to be inmates in a prison. She also didn't want to expose them to the trial itself, stating, "To have 2 young creatures gazed at in a public court would cut me to the very heart." And this, I think, is very much to her credit. Due to her station as a gentlewoman, she was not lodged in the public jail, but instead lived with the jailer and his family, though in relative filth, while awaiting trial. Her ever-devoted husband stayed by her side, regardless of the vulgarity, dirt, noise from morning till night. Cleanliness has ever been his greatest delight, and yet he sees the greasy toast laid by the dirty children on his knees, and feels the small beer trickle down his sleeves on its way across the table, unmoved. The Lee Perrotts lived with this from August until March. The crime Mrs. Lee Perrott was charged with was no small thing. This wasn't petty theft, this was grand larceny. At that time, theft of any item worth 5 shillings or more was punishable by hanging, and this card of lace was worth 24 times the amount. Consider poor James Bajent, who got 3 months for helping to steal 1 duck. What was a more likely sentence in her case, however, would have been transportation to Australia for 14 years, which for a woman of her age and station was tantamount to a death sentence. The devoted Lee Perrott even began to put his affairs in order so that he could accompany his wife to Australia if the worst were to happen. The trial took place on March 29, 1800. Fortunately for the Lee Perrotts, for the Austen Lees and the Lee Perrotts, the jury only took a few minutes to return with a not guilty verdict. The matter was soon hushed up, although the trial allegedly cost the Lee Perrotts £2,000. A small price to pay, given that these were her other two alternatives to the result. Beware the unmeaning luxuries indeed. The scandalous affair was apparently unmentionable in the Austen family, as Jane seemed to never talk about it in her letters, or if she did, they did not survive Cassandra's fiery purge. The episode did not endear the acquitted felon to her niece, however. According to Claire Tomlin, Jane did not like her aunt. Tomlin says, she found her irritating as a penniless niece is likely to find a rich, sometimes overbearing and ungenerous old aunt. This kind of tense relationship is portrayed in Jane Austen's arguably least popular novel, Mansfield Park, although I happen to love it. There is some speculation that Aunt Lee Perrott provided the inspiration for Mrs. Norris, Fanny Price's uncaring aunt. Aunt Norris also had an eye for things which did not belong to her. For instance, she takes the jellies from her niece's wedding, a green baize curtain, which she was in want of, as well as pheasant eggs and a coop. Her niece Maria asks her, "What else have you been sponging?" To which she replies, "Sponging, my dear. It is nothing but 4 of those beautiful pheasant eggs, which Mrs. Whittaker would quite force upon me. She would not take a denial. I dare say she would have taken a denial had that been an option." But to return to Aunt Lee Perrott, whether or not she is indeed the inspiration for Aunt Norris, was she guilty? On the one hand, Mrs. Lee Perrott spoke for herself and on trial, briefly and to great effect. And this was followed by many testimonials to her characters, which were read out in court. The jury only took 10 minutes to reach their not guilty verdict, and her supporters were convinced that she had been framed by unscrupulous blackmailers. I've read one biography that rather perhaps is biased in favor of Jane's aunt. She's described as the rich and respectable Mrs. Lee Perrott and wonders why she was ever even accused. I can personally think of one very good reason why she was accused, but this particular biographer suggests it was blackmail. And this is the evidence. The shopkeeper was known to have a bad character, living unmarried with his assistants, and he was supposedly in financial difficulty. Perhaps he thought his accusation might be bought off by the wealthy Lee Perrotts. Yet, her 4 defense lawyers did not bring a blackmail charge against the shopkeeper, and he continued to flourish. I once met Paula Byrne, who asked and wanted to ask her opinion. Paula's excellent biography, Jane Austen, A Life in Small Things, dedicates a chapter to the card of lace. Her answer was categorically positive. There was no doubt in Paula Byrne's mind that Aunt Lee Perrott was absolutely guilty. And indeed, her own lawyer, Joseph Jekyll, called her a smoocher, which was slang for someone who could and did steal small things. Aunt Lee Perrott also seemed to have a bit of a history. Apparently, years later, she was caught stealing plants from a garden centre. A Bath magistrate wrote a verse on the alleged plant stealing. "To love of plants who has the greatest claim, Darwin the bard or Perrott's wily dame, decide the cause, judge botany, we pray. Let him the laurel take, and her the bay." What I love about this final line in the poem is that the bay could refer to the bay tree plant that she allegedly stole, or to Botany Bay, where she would have been transported had she been found guilty. And what do I think based on the evidence and gossipy, anecdotal, circumspectual ideas? Well, I think she was guilty. I think she did take the lace, but I also think she did not view it as theft. I think she was a petty woman, perhaps, who, though wealthy, had an eye for a bargain. As I said earlier, black lace was cheaper than white, and I think she attempted to bargain down the price of white to the same of black. And when she failed, she bought the black lace but stole the white, seeing it as her due. Hopefully, I've shown you that Jane Austen's life wasn't entirely devoid of scandal. It was hardly barren, and there were several crises that had to be dealt with. Living as Jane Austen did in the age of scandal, it's impossible to think she lived in calm waters all her life. Thank you very much.